We're asking the question today, how has Brexit worked for you? And there's some polling showing that a majority of voters back under-30s migration and a Brexit reset. Let's talk to Philip Kiszely, who's a senior fellow of the New Culture Forum. Philip, great to have you back in the programme. What do you make of this research and polling?
Hi, Peter. First of all, it's great to talk to you. I don't think it's really about Brexit, and I don't really think it's about the EU either. I think it's not about what happened 10 years ago. I think it's about what's happening now, because what people are really concerned about is the idea of leaving Keir Starmer's Britain. That's the one thing that comes out of this, isn't it? We want to be able to go somewhere else. We don't want all of the so-called human rights apparatus that comes along with the EU. We don't want any of the ECHR stuff. We just want the ability to leave. So I think there's something there which speaks very clearly to the now, to the present, and I don't think it really has anything to do with Brexit. I think it's one of these things. I think is a totem, isn't it? It's a symbol which people can kind of either dance around or talk about. And I think there are other things as well. I think there's a real crisis in democracy.
I agree with you, and let's get into that in just a second. But just on the Brexit point, I just have one more question, which is, I mean, is it fair to say, sorry, I don't want to get all philosophical here, Philip, but I can't get a bit philosophical with you. Who can I get a bit philosophical with? I mean, does Brexit just mean different things to different people? Is it the same thing to everybody?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it does mean different things to different people. And one of the things that Brexit is really about, it's about emotion. You know, and that's right in lots of ways. You know, I was an ardent Brexiteer, still am. I voted essentially for the keys to the front door. That's what I wanted. Philosophically, I wanted to be able to kind of live in a country that governed itself, and an outward-looking country that is all about trade and is all about the international community itself, but fundamentally has sovereignty. That really hasn't happened. And when something doesn't happen, and something that is very important to so many people, when that is taken away, and when we are gaslighted about that, yes, of course, it becomes massively emotional, and it becomes a vehicle for other things. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing Brexit as this emotional, this car that takes us somewhere else and allows us to talk about other things.
In terms of what you were talking about a second ago in regard to democracy changing and the whole idea of democracy changing and society changing, just develop that thought for us a little bit, Philip, because really, I mean, you can call it what you want, populism, Reform UK, Donald Trump. I mean, the whole paradigm of politics is shifting, isn't it?
I think it is, and I think and again, Brexit is probably at the centre of that. So over the last 10, 15, 20 years, the British public have constantly said that they are frightened of mass immigration. I don't think this is about bigotry. I don't think it's about racism. It's certainly not about immigration per se. It's about the lack of control, and constantly, certainly the Tory government have a lot to answer for here. But you know, and now obviously the Labour government, they are just completely ignoring the British people. So I think there's a crisis in democracy. There was a poll just this week, which you might have seen, Peter, which said something like over 40% of young people would like a dictator.
I did see that. Yeah, it was very concerning. I just thought there are just so many people who don't feel democracy is working for them, that their voice just isn't heard.
Well, it's over 40% of young people, but probably more alarming is that, you know, there was 35% of people, you know, from 35 to 45 as well. So this isn't just young people who have grown up in the midst of crisis. This isn't just young people with young ideas who are flown by revolution. This is a great swathe of the country who are completely alienated or look to different models. And we're not actually, I think for most of these people, we're not talking about Donald Trump, and we're not talking about freedom of speech, and we're not talking about controlling DIE, all of those things. I think we're talking about a Stalin-esque dictator. I think we're talking about all of these woke ideas which have closed down freedom of speech. And that's the thing that's really, really frightening. So if if you put together a couple of things, if you put together what people are learning in schools and universities, if you put together the massive demographic change that comes with a complete shift in culture, if you talk about the balkanization of the country, people are frightened, people are retreating, people are saying, well, you can't have democracy when all of these factors play. And in some ways it's understandable, but it's incredibly concerning. And this is why we have to deal with the key issues. We have to look at actually what's happening. And we don't do that. We look to other things. We look to symbols, as I say, and we deal with emotion rather than facts, statistics, and what's going on.
And politics all often is and is increasingly an emotional process. I totally agree with what you're saying there, Philip. It's really interesting as well. Let's talk about one of the personalities who a lot of people may not have heard of necessarily. This is Richard Hermer, Lord Hermer, who has talked about his support for EU law, and he's been criticised, saying that undermines border reforms. I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Richard Hermer. He's a big mate of Keir Starmer. They worked together previously, they've been lawyers together, and I for one am pretty concerned. I mean, he represented Gerry Adams previously, he's been involved in some of the representation around Shamima Begum, and also, you know, some of his pro-Palestinian views are things that I would be very concerned about as well. But he's a very, very, very powerful figure as Attorney General within the government, and has been criticised for being so in the last day or two as well.
Yeah, he's a very shadowy figure, mainly because he was parachuted in by Keir Starmer. It's almost as though he's completely sidestepped all of the democratic process.
Justice for Emily Thornberry, that's what I say. I think I'm probably the first person who's ever said that.
Yeah, well, it's a first on this show, certainly. So all of the things we're talking about, he's a really good representation of all of them. Okay, so you've talked about his enthusiasm for Palestine. He is that kind of most forlorn of creatures, a human rights lawyer. He's best mates with Keir Starmer. You've already talked about his representation of Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA, and the ramifications of that are staggering in the sense that Gerry Adams might well be receiving compensation for the 1970s.
But of course, Philip, Gerry Adams was never a member of the IRA. We believe you, Gerry.
Right, yes, I'm not saying yes, the political wing. So all of these things are working against fundamentally the zeitgeist, the feeling of the country. You put the technocracy, the human rights obsession, the EU focus against the burgeoning populism of reform, for example, and you see an absolute clash of ideologies. You see a clash of philosophy, and it's almost as though Keir Starmer and the figure of Richard Hermer in particular, they're almost like an occupying power. They're almost, it's like a fifth column. They're
legitimately, of course. I mean, Keir Starmer is democratically elected.
Yes, he's democratically elected, and of course I'm not saying he's not.
No, sure.
It just feels to me that Richard Hermer in particular signals something that's really sinister that's happened. And it's this pushing of an agenda no matter what. And we've had enough of that in the past, but this is now going on steroids. Because the one thing about the Tories, they weren't ideological. They just wanted to stay in power. It was just about the preservation of power. With Labour, it's about that, but it's also ideology on steroids. It's an ideology that benefits everybody else apart from the British people.